Karoline Leavitt assumed this would be another interview, a soft target, a standard debate. But what ensued, nobody anticipated. The instant the host lost composure, the internet witnessed the truth in real time. Karoline Leavitt had conducted thousands of interviews previously, some courteous, some combative, but she had never faltered, never questioned herself until this moment. One late night, an email appeared in her mailbox. Exclusive invitation, the Franklin Hour. This wasn't your typical political chat show. This was one of the country's largest. Millions tuned in at home. Graham Franklin was the host. His reputation precedes him. He was a veteran media fixture with a wicked sense of humor and a particular talent for making conservative guests blush. His interviews were not interrogation. They were eviscerations, viral segments of his guests stuttering under fire while his crowd exploded with laughter came close to happening nearly every week. Karoline scanned the email. A primetime slot, a live audience, a massive platform, but she knew the truth. This wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. Her team wasn't thrilled. "You know how this goes," her media advisor Tom warned. "Franklin doesn't do fair debates. He sets people up and tears them down." Karoline set her phone down, unfazed. "I'm not worried about Franklin," she said. "I'm worried about whether people will actually listen." For years, she had made a name for herself by slicing through media bias, refusing to back down when others did. This time wouldn't be different either, or at least so she thought, because Graham Franklin wasn't your average host. He was a master manipulator, making even the best arguments go viral and get takedown. This wasn't an interview. This was an ambush, packaged as a chat. Despite all this, she accepted. Her staff worked incessantly in the days leading up to the interview. Mock debates were done, Franklin's toughest strategies explored, loaded questions, sniping with sarcasm, constant interruption designed to throw visitors off kilter. Statistics were memorized, counterpoints rehearsed, her delivery honed. She knew nonetheless, deep in her heart, a good preparation still couldn't assure her what exactly would transpire. As the evening of the interview rolled around, she walked into the stylish, cutting-edge studio in Los Angeles. The lights were harsh, the cameras were rolling, the audience was abuzz with anticipation. And as she sat down in front of Graham Franklin, she knew in that instant there was no going back. The stage was set. Giant LED screens flashed in the background behind the host's desk. Dazzling studio lights poured down from overhead. The air was charged with anticipation. As soon as Karoline entered the green room, she sensed it. The air was thick with tension. Workers rushed by her, speaking in hushed tones. Producers looked at one another with expressions that weren't telling as she passed by them. They weren't gearing up to do an interview. They were gearing up to put on a show. A junior producer, barely looking up from his clipboard, handed her a mic pack. "You're up in 5. Franklin's wrapping up his monologue." Karoline took a deep breath. The air felt heavier than usual, but she shoved the feeling aside. She had been in tough rooms before. This was just another one. A stagehand waved her forward. The applause had already started. The crowd was abuzz, hyped, ready, anticipating another viral demolition. They had witnessed this before. A conservative guest enters with confidence and exits embarrassed. As Karoline entered the stage, Graham Franklin stood in the middle, smirking. "Welcome, Karoline." He held out a hand. "Courageous of you to be here." First swipe, passed off as a compliment. She took his hand, her face impassive. She already knew precisely how this was going to unfold. What Franklin didn't know? This time the tables were going to turn. The moment she sat down, she sensed it. A change in the atmosphere. The audience wasn't merely observing. They were waiting for Franklin to strike, to spin his tale, to have her running around in circles. Graham Franklin adjusted his tie, sitting down in his chair with the sort of self-satisfied smugness that comes with decades of having complete dominion over his kingdom. "Karoline Leavitt," he started, his tone smooth but with a trace of sarcasm. "Conservative firebrand, self-styled truth-teller. Quite a reputation." Karoline smiled graciously, totally unflappable. "I'm glad to accept the invitation." Franklin laughed, settling back. "Naturally, we always like to hear differing viewpoints." And then with a characteristic smirk, he looked at the crowd, even the ones that emanate from within an echo chamber. Laughter swirled through the room. Others laughed a little too hard, already loving the game before it had even started. Karoline did not laugh. She had anticipated this. Franklin leafed through his papers, positioning himself for his next move. "You discuss a lot of media bias, how conservative viewpoints get suppressed, and yet, here you are." He swept his arm wide across the brightly lit stage. "Seated across from me, on one of the biggest platforms in the nation." He turned to the crowd, flashing a smile. "So tell me, Karoline, How exactly does that fit into your silenced story? The crowd applauded. Franklin sneered. He believed he had already sown the first seed of doubt, but Karoline didn't bat an eye. She clasped her hands on the desk, looked him in the eye, and landed her first blow. Being invited onto a show, she said matter-of-factly, doesn't mean having a fair conversation. And there we go. The game was on. Caroline's voice was still firm. It doesn't equate to an honest conversation, she replied, voice not wavering. It simply means being dished up as entertainment. Franklin quirked an eyebrow, pretending to be interested. Is that what you imagine this is? A circus act? Karoline did not flinch. It's a pattern, she insisted. You hire conservatives, cut them off, twist their words, and by the time they're gone, all anyone recalls is your monologue. For the first time, Franklin faltered. No quick retort. The crowd murmured. Some people shifted. So you're calling me unfair? Franklin finally asked. That I twist words? Karoline leaned forward just a bit. I don't need to tell you, she said. Your clips do it for you. A few more murmurs spread through the audience. Franklin cleared his throat, sitting back in his chair. For one moment, his confidence faltered, but he wasn't going to let that happen. He leaned in, his face growing hard, calculating. Let's discuss truth, shall we? He turned over a piece of paper, his smile resurfacing. Because I have some of your previous statements here, he said, tapping the page, and I'd appreciate it if you could explain them. Karoline saw it coming, the setup. This was Franklin's go-to move, pulling out old quotes, taking them out of context, making his guests defend something misleading, or waste time setting the record straight. She knew she had to be quick. She met his gaze head-on. Go ahead, she said. Let's discuss truth. Franklin smiled, thinking his time had come. He looked at his papers. You once told us, and I quote, the mainstream media would rather push propaganda than admit the facts. He laid the paper aside and sat back. Do you actually believe that, Karoline? Or is that what you say to get people all fired up? He felt confident he had her on the defensive, but Karoline didn't blink. She folded her hands together, her tone calm. I believe the facts speak for themselves, she said. Then without missing a beat, she turned the tables. So let me ask you, Graham, how many times has this network had to retract a story in the last 2 years? Silence. The audience held their breath. Franklin's smirk flickered, just for a moment, and Karoline wasn't done yet. Karoline's voice remained calm, unwavering. How many times, she asked, has the media jumped the gun on a story before getting all the facts? She left the question to hang. And when that story is proven to be incorrect, how often is the retraction given the same airtime as the original story? A shift. The easy laughter that had come so easily before? Gone. Franklin's jaw braced slightly. His fingers tugged over the pile of paper in front of him. He rearranged his papers, taking himself a second to collect his thoughts. Karoline could spot it now, the uneasiness creeping forward. He'd anticipated a fight. He'd not anticipated a mirror. Franklin was, however, a veteran. He picked up speed fast, forcing a closed-lipped grin as he shifted forward, clasped hands, a teacher's body language preparing to correct a rogue student. Ah, Karoline, he said suavely, that's a wonderful deflection. But we're not here to discuss my network. We're here to discuss you and your allegations. So let's keep to that, shall we? Karoline didn't blink. I believed we were here to discuss the truth. She allowed the words to hang before going on. If the media purports to be objective and consistently manipulates stories to adhere to a given agenda, isn't that relevant? Franklin forced a chuckle, shuddering his head. That's a sharp way to evade the question. He picked up a sheet of paper and displayed it. Let's approach this again, he said. You did say once, the media and government cooperate to repress inconvenient truths. He placed the paper on a surface and elevated a brow. That sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it? There it was, the setup. The moment Franklin would attempt to paint her as a fringe extremist, someone too radical to be taken seriously. If she pushed back too hard, she'd be labeled paranoid. If she softened her stance, she'd be accused of backtracking. It was a trap. Karoline took a slow breath, grounding herself. Then, steady as ever, she answered, It's not a conspiracy theory if it's documented fact. A murmur ran through the crowd. The government has pressured tech companies to censor certain information. She looked Franklin straight in the eye. There are emails proving it, public records confirming it. If that's a conspiracy, it's one backed up by their own paper trail. A few heads in the audience turned, whispers. Franklin's jaw clenched for a moment before he forced another smirk. Tap, tap, tap. His fingers tapped on the desk. And yet, he said, his voice slow and measured, the largest media in the nation don't write about it like you do. He leaned forward, eyes piercing. Why do you think that happens? Karoline cocked her head. And then she made her next move. Because they profit from it. A discernible shift in the room. The audience weren't just hearing anymore. They were thinking. Franklin's fingers tapped against the desk. Faster now. A nervous rhythm. Oh, so now the entire mainstream media is corrupt? His voice lifted slightly. The first crack in his usual smooth delivery. Every single journalist is in on this grand scheme? Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a small, almost amused smile. You're proving my point right now. Franklin blinked. Excuse me. She gestured around them. Look at how you're framing this. Her voice was calm, controlled. I never said every journalist, but instead of addressing the facts, you're turning this into a caricature, like I'm some lunatic ranting about shadowy figures in a dark room. A murmur rippled through the audience. They were seeing it now, how the conversation was being shaped, how the narrative was being controlled. Franklin's gaze flicked toward the producers. He could feel it. He was losing control, but he wasn't done yet. He inhaled sharply, then suddenly leaned back, his arms wide apart, taking on a more relaxed tone. The reset, the pivot. Okay, Karoline, he said smoothly. Let's switch to something easy, something everybody can get along with. A tried and true tactic. When cornered, change the battlefield. Karoline recognized what was coming. Franklin drew out another piece of paper. Let's discuss January 6th, the crowd murmured. Karoline recognized the trap immediately. It was always the default topic. The instant any conservative guest was put into a no-win position, condemn their home base, or be charged with upholding extremism. Franklin pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, voice measured. You've been pretty hard on the media coverage of the event, he said. So let's be crystal clear. Do you think it was an insurrection? Karoline met his eye. I think violence is wrong. I think political violence is wrong. Whether it occurs in a federal building, outside a courthouse, or on city streets. A measured response. Franklin's smirk came back, the predator smelling blood. That's a good practiced response. He leaned in. But that's not what I asked. Karoline didn't flinch. I answered the question. You just don't want to hear the answer. The audience shifted once more. They sensed it too. Franklin let out a breath, tapped his notes. His annoyance was beginning to surface. The control he had over the discussion, slipping away from him, and for the first time in a long time, Graham Franklin was at a loss for what to say next. The audience wasn't in his corner. Franklin could sense it, and it shook him. But instead of stepping back, he pressed forward, and that was his biggest error. His patience was wearing thin. He had flung every trick in the book. Sarcasm, misdirection, condescension. But Karoline wasn't moving. Worse, the audience wasn't responding the way they typically did. No laughter, no nodding in agreement. This wasn't going his way. Franklin's eyes flicked down to his notes, then back up. His expression shifted. The gloves were off. All right, he said, voice lower now. Since we're talking about truth, let's talk about you. Karoline didn't flinch. Franklin leaned in, fingers tapping against the desk. A slow, calculated rhythm. You talk a lot about accountability, transparency, and honesty. Tap, tap, tap. But let's put that to the test, shall we? The studio was silent. He turned to a fresh page in his folder. The ambush. The last play. Karoline, you've been in politics. You understand how the game is played. His words were laced with accusation. You've stood up for individuals who've made inflammatory remarks, people who've disseminated misinformation. He raised his eyes, meeting hers. And here you are, pretending you're above it. Karoline elevated an eyebrow, unimpressed. Is there a question in there, or are we just throwing out accusations? A buzz ran through the crowd. Franklin's mouth curled into a sneer. Fine. You want direct? Let's make it direct. He leaned in, eyes squinting. Have you ever misled your audience? There it was. The trap. A question not meant for truth. A question meant for a soundbite. If she hesitated, no matter how briefly, he'd pounce. If she said no, he'd accuse her of arrogance. If she said yes, he'd call her a hypocrite. Karoline breathed slowly, carefully. Then she responded. I talk about what I think is true, based on the facts at hand. Her voice was firm, unflinching. If new facts come to light, I admit them. That's intellectual honesty. She inclined her head fractionally. And something we might benefit from more of in media today. A change. Franklin's sneer faltered. That wasn't the answer he desired. The audience was transfixed, watching him now, not her. His hold on the conversation, slipping. Franklin scanned his notes again, desperate now. He needed to strike harder, because if he didn't, he had already lost. Your intellectual honesty appears a bit selective. Franklin's tone was cutting, questioning. Karoline folded her arms, waiting. The air in the room grew charged. Franklin cleared his throat, regrouped. This had to stick. In 2021, You tweeted that the mainstream media would not report increasing rates of crime. He turned a page. But we pulled the figures, and actually several news outlets had covered it. A smirk, a provocation. Karoline didn't flinch. Which news outlets? Her voice was level, unflappable. And more importantly, how much attention did they receive? She leaned slightly to one side. Compared to, for example, celebrity news? Political scandal? The audience shifted. Franklin glanced down at his notes, turned through them. The moment lingered too long, and in that split second, the audience sensed it. He didn't have the figures. Karoline smiled faintly, shoved forward. See, that's the issue, Graham. She waved her hand lightly. The media are always saying, "Oh, we covered it." A silence. But they never discuss how they covered it. Franklin's hold on his notes tightened. Karoline leaned forward. Was it a passing reference? A buried story? A 2-minute report at 2 a.m. when nobody was watching? Or, she paused for a moment, did they cover it the way they cover stories that fit their narrative? Wall-to-wall coverage, headline after headline, panel discussions, opinion pieces, viral clips. Her voice was steady, measured. So sure, maybe they technically covered crime. She shrugged. But did they make it a priority? A beat? Did they cover it as seriously as they should have? The audience murmured. Franklin gritted his jaw, fingers tightening on his notes. He was losing control. And then it happened. His frustration boiled over, and he snapped. "Oh, give me a break, Karoline." His voice was sharp, clipped, angry. "You act like some kind of victim, but in reality, you're just another talking head pushing propaganda like everyone else." The room froze. Even the audience, who had laughed along with his jabs all night, fell silent. For the first time in years, Franklin had lost his composure on live television. Karoline leaned back in her chair, expression calm, unmoved. She didn't need to say a single word, because he had just illustrated her point for her. Franklin was aware of it too. He puffed out hard, tugged at his tie, attempted to regain ground, but too late, because the moment was already viral. The tension in the studio lingered awkwardly. Franklin's tirade had fallen like a brick through glass, barking, disheveled, impossible to miss. Karoline didn't have to react. She had already won. She simply observed, calm, unfazed, as Franklin attempted to regain control of the room, fidgeting with his tie, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, forcing a grin that no longer looked confident. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The producers must have sensed it too, because suddenly a sharp voice cut through Karoline's earpiece. "We're going to commercial." The words were clipped, urgent. Franklin barely nodded before the studio lights dimmed. The screen faded to black, and the theme music played. But nobody was paying attention. As soon as the cameras were off, Franklin yanked off his earpiece and slammed it onto the desk. "What the hell was that?" Low, but the frustration was unmistakable. Karoline sat still, unfazed. "That?" She nodded her head a little. "That was you losing your temper." Franklin's laugh was a short, humorless sound. It wasn't laughing. It was frustrated. Producers rushed around him. One whispered in his ear. Another pointed towards the control room. Karoline overheard bits. "Twitter is blowing up. We need to deal with it when we're back." "Do we pivot?" They were in a panic. One of Franklin's aides walked up to Karoline hesitantly. "Miss Leavitt, would you care for a glass of water?" Karoline hardly looked at her. "No, I'm fine." She wasn't the one requiring cooling down. Franklin scrubbed a hand over his face, grumbling to his producer in the meantime. Damage control. That's what this was. Karoline could already picture the spin they were going to give it. Perhaps they'd trim the clips afterwards, cutting out the sections that made him appear weak. Maybe Franklin would crack a joke in the next segment, play it off as a spirited debate. But what he didn't realize? It was already too late. Because before the commercial break even ended, the moment had exploded online. Trending topic number 1, Franklin versus Leavitt. The clip was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. People were dissecting it in real time. Did Franklin just completely lose it on Karoline Leavitt? I've never seen him this rattled before. She got under his skin bad. And then the memes. Franklin's face, mid-rant. GIFs of Karoline's placid, near-smiling face. Some with captions such as, "When the debate doesn't go as planned, Franklin," when he realizes he's not in control anymore. Even individuals who disagreed with Karoline were chiming in. "I don't like her politics, but she handled that interview like a PRO." Say what you will about her, but Franklin just made a fool of himself. And within an hour, the damage was done. The video had millions of views on platforms. By the time the show came back from commercial, the damage was done. Franklin put on a forced, stiff smile as the cameras resumed. His voice was lighter now, almost playful, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just occurred. "Well, that was a spirited debate," he said, laughing as if it was all in good humor. "Karoline, you really know how to make things interesting." Karoline smiled in return, but this time, she had nothing to prove. "I just think in terms of honest talk, Graham." The audience applauded. Not for him, for her. And he knew it. The segment ended soon after that. Franklin didn't dare press further. He read from the teleprompter, thanked her for appearing, shook her hand with just a bit too much vigor, and the instant the show concluded, he was history. But Karoline's evening wasn't through. The moment she left the studio, her phone blew up. Texts, calls, mentions, her staff, reporters, supporters, even her detractors. Everybody needed a quote. News organizations were already crafting headlines. Graham Franklin loses his cool in fiery exchange with Karoline Leavitt. Karoline Leavitt exposes Franklin's bias on live TV. Talk show host has meltdown after guest pushes back. Others attempted to spin it otherwise. Karoline Leavitt sparks controversy with host, but it didn't matter because the internet had already made up its mind. Franklin wasn't the fearless journalist taking on the establishment. He was the embodiment of media hubris, caught in the act. This wasn't merely about one interview. Karoline knew that. Moments like this weren't isolated TV confrontations. They were a part of something larger, a building irritation with the way public conversation was being managed, packaged, and manipulated. She hadn't appeared on that show hoping to win something. She went to be heard. And for once, the viewers got to witness what happened when someone wouldn't play the game. But the question was really, what would Franklin do next? Would he take ownership of his response? Own up to having been wrong? Or would he, like most before him, double down and be a victim? Karoline had her best guess, and before long, the world would know. The morning after, the media broke loose. Each major news operation covered the moment, each coloring it in his or her turn. Some packaged Franklin's meltdown as a passionate reaction. Others painted it as a childish, unprofessional meltdown. But it wouldn't matter, for the internet had already ruled. Bits of the raw interview flooded the social media sites. The uncut, uncensored version, in which Franklin lost his temper, tens of millions of views. Overnight, it was obvious. The fallout individuals weren't merely discussing what occurred. They were dissecting what it symbolized. By noon, Franklin had put out a statement via his show's official handle. Last night's interview with Karoline Leavitt was a lively debate. Though I maintained my questioning, I apologize that I allowed my frustration to get the better of me. I believe in tough debates and open to differing opinions. I thank Karoline for appearing and participating in the debate. The language was chosen with care, not an apology, not a complete denial, just a PR written statement designed to oil the waters without acknowledging what everyone had already witnessed. But Karoline knew better, and she wasn't alone. The response was vicious. Translation: I got destroyed on live TV and I don't want to discuss it. He didn't let frustration show. He lost it because he couldn't deal with someone resisting. Just admit you were out of line, Graham. It's not that hard. While Karoline's platform blew up, followers doubled, then tripled. Podcasts, news shows, interviews, her email was flooded. Everyone asked for her opinion, but Karoline didn't want a victory lap because this wasn't just about one debate or one viral moment. It was about something more, the bigger picture. In the days ahead, people continued to argue about what went on. Some came to Franklin's defense. He was just frustrated. Others interpreted it differently. He exposed himself, not as a tough, talking journalist, but as precisely what he accused others of being, a biased individual who couldn't stand real discussion. But one thing was certain, people saw the truth for themselves. No well-edited piece, no deceptive headlines, just an unvarnished moment when someone who dominated the narrative lost control. And that's why it mattered, because this wasn't just about Franklin. It was about how conversations in America are framed, how media personalities kill topics rather than discussing them, how humans are fatigued with being dictated to what to think. Karoline had hit a nerve, and that's what terrified them most. A week later, Franklin's show resumed normalcy. No reference to the interview, no mention of what transpired. They wanted to advance, but the internet never forgets, and neither did the individuals who witnessed what occurred that evening. Karoline understood that this was not the final battle. There would be more moments, more attempts to manipulate the narrative, more attempts to shut down real conversation. But she also understood something. The more they attempted to stifle the truth, the more individuals would begin to take notice. Because once you see beyond the game, you never look at it the same way again. The final message. If you learn something from this story, don't let it stop here. Think for yourself, question all, and above all, Never be afraid to voice your opinion, because the moment you cease to speak, they win, and we can't let that happen.